August 23, 1950, the Daiichi Building in Tokyo. The air in the conference room was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. The highest-ranking military officers of the United States were gathered, and they were terrified. 2 months earlier, the North Korean People's Army had poured across the 38th parallel. They had crushed South Korean defenses. They had pushed the United Nations forces back, mile by bloody mile, into a tiny corner of the peninsula known as the Pusan Perimeter. The Allies were clinging to the edge of the sea. Defeat wasn't just a possibility, it was days away. General J. Lawton Collins, Army Chief of Staff, and Admiral Forrest Sherman, Chief of Naval Operations, had flown all the way from Washington with a specific mission: to talk General Douglas MacArthur out of a suicide mission. MacArthur wanted to launch an amphibious invasion behind enemy lines. He wanted to strike at the port city of Incheon. The men in the room looked at the maps. Then they looked at MacArthur. And then they looked at the Navy experts. The Navy had a list of reasons why Incheon was impossible. Not difficult, impossible. The naval briefing officer stood up and began to list the nightmares. First, the tides. Incheon had the second highest tidal range in the world, over 30 feet. When the tide went out, it left behind miles of screaming mudflats that would trap any ship, any landing craft, and any soldier. The Navy only had a 3-hour window to land an entire invasion force before the water vanished. Second, the approach. The channel into Incheon was called Flying Fish Channel. It was narrow, winding, and mined. If one ship was hit, it would block the channel and trap the entire fleet. Third, the city itself. There were no beaches. Incheon was surrounded by massive stone seawalls. The Marines wouldn't be running onto sand. They would have to climb 12-foot stone walls using ladders directly into the guns of the North Korean defenders. The briefing officer finished his presentation with a grim conclusion. General, the Navy considers an amphibious landing at Incheon to be a 5,000 to 1 shot. The room went silent. Collins and Sherman nodded. The logic was irrefutable. It was a geographical nightmare. No sane commander would risk the last reserves of the U.S. military on a 5,000 to 1 shot. Then MacArthur stood up. He was 70 years old, but his voice was like iron. He acknowledged every difficulty. He admitted the tides were dangerous. He admitted the channel was a trap. But then he said something that stunned them. The very impossibility of the proposition is the guarantee of its success. MacArthur understood something the others didn't. The North Koreans were smart. Their commanders had studied the same maps. They knew about the tides and the mud and the seawalls. They knew Incheon was impossible to invade. Therefore, they wouldn't defend it. MacArthur compared the Pusan perimeter to an anvil. He needed a hammer to smash the enemy against it. Incheon was that hammer. He looked at Admiral Sherman. Admiral, the Navy has never let me down, and it will not let me down now. The room was still quiet, but the energy had shifted. MacArthur wasn't asking for permission. He was telling them how he was going to win the war. Washington reluctantly gave the green light. Operation Chromite was a go. But MacArthur wasn't just relying on intuition. Like Patton, he had prepared. While the generals in Tokyo were arguing about tides, a single American naval officer was already there. September 1st, 1950, 2 weeks before the invasion. Lieutenant Eugene Clark, a Navy specialist, landed on a tiny island at the mouth of Incheon Harbor. He wasn't there to fight, he was there to watch. Clark and a small team of South Korean commandos lived behind enemy lines for 2 weeks. They were cold, they were hunted, and they were constantly sending radio messages back to Tokyo. The Navy charts were old. Clark had to measure the tides himself. He waded into the freezing mud at night, measuring water levels with a stick, calculating exactly when the invasion force could land. He scouted the seawalls. He located the North Korean gun positions. He found out the terrifying truth.
The mud was even worse than they thought. In some places, it was soft enough to swallow a man whole. But he also found the weak point. The seawall at Red Beach was scaling height. On the night of September 14th, a typhoon raged through the Yellow Sea. The invasion fleet was tossed around like toys. The commanders considered turning back. The weather was impossible. But MacArthur ordered them forward. September 15th, 1950, 6:30 a.m., the tide rushed in. The water level rose 30 feet in hours. The invasion fleet navigated the narrow channel, guided by a lighthouse that Eugene Clark had lit manually just minutes before. The North Koreans were asleep. They had believed the impossible. Suddenly, the sky tore open. Naval guns and aerial bombardment shattered the silence. The 1st Marine Division raced toward the seawalls.
They didn't have ramps. They had aluminum ladders. The Marines scrambled up the ladders, expecting heavy resistance. They found shocked, disorganized defenders. The North Korean commander at Incheon had sent reports days earlier saying an invasion was impossible. He hadn't bothered to mine the harbor properly. He hadn't reinforced the seawalls. Within hours, the Marines had secured the beachhead. By nightfall, they had broken out into the city. The 5,000-to-1 shot had paid off. The surprise was absolute. The North Korean supply lines, which ran through Seoul just a few miles east, were severed. The North Korean army, thousands of miles to the south at Pusan, suddenly found themselves cut off. They had no food, no ammo, and an American army behind them. The collapse was instant. The enemy army that had nearly pushed the U.S. into the sea disintegrated. MacArthur signaled Washington, "The Navy and Marines have never shone more brightly than this morning." The Incheon landing remains one of the boldest military maneuvers in history. It defied geography, it defied weather, and it defied the advice of every expert in the room. But like Patton at the Bulge, MacArthur succeeded because he understood the psychology of his enemy. He knew that in war, the most dangerous course of action is often the safest, simply because the enemy believes no one is crazy enough to try it. Washington had looked at the maps and saw a disaster. MacArthur looked at the same maps and saw an opportunity. And because he was willing to bet everything on the impossible, the course of the Korean War was reversed in a single day. The victory at Incheon was more than just a tactical success. It was a psychological decapitation of the North Korean military. Within 2 weeks of the landing, the United Nations forces had recaptured Seoul. The North Korean People's Army, once an unstoppable juggernaut, was now a broken force fleeing north toward the Yalu River. However, the legacy of Incheon is often debated. Critics argue that the success of the impossible landing gave MacArthur a sense of invincibility, a belief that he could outthink any enemy and ignore any warning. This hubris would lead to a different kind of disaster just months later when the Chinese military entered the war, a move MacArthur's intelligence staff, much like the staff at SHA during the Bulge, insisted would never happen. The strategy of the great captains. Both Patton at the Bulge and MacArthur at Incheon demonstrated the 3 pillars of military genius. Trust in intelligence. Patton trusted Oscar Koch. MacArthur trusted the ground-level scouting of Eugene Clark. Calculated risk. They didn't ignore the dangers, snow, mud, tides. They incorporated them into a plan that weaponized the enemy's own assumptions. Speed of execution. In war, a good plan executed violently and immediately is often better than a perfect plan executed next week.